So my name is Lisa. I work at the Center for Microfinance, and I've presented on this study before. So I think last time we had just collected field data from one of our two study areas, and we had really began kind of putting together some of the hypothesis and shaping the study, understanding exactly what we're looking to identify and understand from the data that we're collecting. So this will be building upon that.
I think you need to
turn it on.
Yeah.
Okay. So the research areas basically are two districts, Parbhani and Jalna. They're near Aurangabad, the lower basins that are there. Kind of eastern Maharashtra near the Andhra border, which is significant for the study. So that's good to keep in mind. So basically, the defaults occurred right basically after or around the Andhra Pradesh crisis. They started first in Parbhani, and basically happened from, October. This is actually incorrect. I would say from early October until late November, early December in Parbhani. And in Jalna, they occurred about a month later. So kind of going over from December to January, maybe a bit into February. And our research, we worked in Jalna in October, November, and then we finished up our work in Parbhani in January and February. So the motivation behind the study is kind of twofold. And when I say this study, I should kind of like categorize what I'm speaking of. So the motivation for our qualitative based fieldwork is basically what I'm speaking of. So it's to understand or follow up on some of these questions, right? So what's the underlying cause of the default? Which is, actually quite an interesting question when you start looking at the responses of the women that we interviewed. More interestingly as well, what sparks the default? What was that thing that kind of ignited the community reaction and that, caused the mass amount of people to start defaulting on their loans? How did the information about the default spread? Is there any way of kind of measuring the contagion? How is that information transmitted? And it's actually different in Jalna, that's something that I'll talk about. And what are the causes cited by the groups that we interviewed for why they were defaulting, as opposed to how they kind of saw the overall cause of the default, right? So what did they say were the causes for the default within the city, and then why did they persist the default? That's something else that's really interesting to go into. But so apart from kind of understanding these kind of like simple, basic conceptual ideas surrounding the default, we're also using this as an opportunity to test some of our initial, more quantitative hypotheses, right? So we conducted a client survey, and we have about 280 observations, loan observations from that. And so we're able to test, although not very powerfully, but to some extent, we're able to test hypotheses that we hope to then move on to these larger client data sets provided by microfinance companies, right? Where we'll have much more power and hopefully be able to see if there is kind of any significant trends that are worth discussing. So we kind of do we're in the process of doing some simple tests and seeing if they show any kind of significance, and then we'll kind of move forward to the larger client. And so building on that last part, the hypothesis that we've kind of gained from this initial client survey that we've been testing is multiple lending or over-indebtedness results in a higher probability of default. We think it'd also be interesting to look at an income to debt ratio. Now, something that's not going to be, unfortunately, available for us when we do the quantitative testing on the larger microfinance data set, because it's difficult for us to pair or match across data sets, right? In fact, we're probably not going to even try because it seems really simple, that maybe I'll get very ambitious. But so when in our client data, we're actually, asking each individual client, how many loans did you have during the time period? How many MFIs were you working with? So we can collect that information. And we can see what the actual indebtedness of the household is. Which is really exciting and useful, but again, it's from a smaller sample, so the power is again difficult. So secondly, do we find anecdotal evidence of peer effects? To what extent is group performance affecting individual repayment? So this is something that's quite observable in our field level data, where we can see individuals or groups specifically saying, I could not repay my loan because somebody else in my group defaulted, right? So, and I guess peer effects being kind of two things, right? So somebody within your group defaulting, the group not being able to, kind of withhold the balance of payment to continue the payment. So everybody else defaults, right? So, and that default being caused by this kind of larger external default, right? So what evidence do we see of that? And then also, what evidence do we see of groups, kind of defaulting because of other group defaults or within their center? So just trying to, obviously there's going to be a lot of correlation there between an individual and a group defaulting, but trying to measure to what extent, looking at timing-wise, and seeing if the hypothesis kind of being that there's going to be a clustering effect, where you see groups and individuals kind of fully not defaulting or fully defaulting. And so the implications of this being kind of, what's the risk of these kind of JLG group models when you do still have uncertainty and risk within community environments, right? And I think, how does that impact loan portfolios for a company? Kind of as discussions have continued to develop over the last several years about transitioning away from a JLG model, I think that this could be something that's really interesting to look at. Obviously, mass community defaults don't happen all the time, but they do happen. And the fact that we're still quite peer dependent in our models affects the outcomes of these community defaults as well. And lastly, and I would say this is a major component of our kind of quantitative hypothesis testing. Are there any kind of demographic, client level, or loan characteristics which have a significant impact on an individual's likelihood of default, right? So demographic information may be just name, income, number of dependents in the household, age, marital status, occupation, any of these things, right? We look at kind of across the board. Client characteristics, I think, is a bit more interesting. So looking at kind of the age of a client within the MFI, number of loan cycles they've had, the variance in their loan cycle amounts, the amount of money they're getting with each loan. So stuff like that. And then loan characteristics, which is generally loan size, kind of looking right now. But so looking at these kind of different characteristics of clients and individuals and seeing if they have an impact on default. So this is just kind of a basic outline of our field level research design. So we conducted branch interviews and credit officer interviews just to kind of, we're not really using that data in our testing, more just kind of in the qualitative analysis, but to get a sense of the environment, to get a sense of the context. And so then we basically have two major sources of data which we're pulling from this presentation. Facilitated group discussions, which we conducted in both Jalna and Parbhani, and then pulling from these facilitated group discussions, we asked 2 to 3 individuals per FGE group to be part of our client interviews. Approximately 2 people per FGE group. Then we were recording past and current loans for those individuals And so this is the number of loans cited. This would be useful if I could, if I had put up current loans as well. So loans that were current at the time of the default, right? And so those are kind of like what we're looking for. We look at overall loans of any individual that we interview, but the significant ones are the ones that occurred within a year of the default. So there is the potential for default. So this is just basic sample description. Before we do any analysis, kind of just wanted to look at the overall sample and see if characteristics were matching up. So basically, and you'll see that surprisingly, actually, in Jalna and Parbhani, it's incredibly similar, which I guess is a good thing. We did as much random sampling as possible. But so mean age is 37 years, for individuals, all female, so we interviewed. Age range, average monthly income, average years of education, so that would be the year completed. Marital status, dependent. So for dependents, that was an indicator that we created, which basically was we asked the household how many individuals live with you under 16 or over 55, in order to get a sense of how many non-working individuals in the household, right? So on average, 2.7 dependents per household. This is just a religious composition. Because of the I guess, kind of issues surrounding the default, that's important to note. And this, again, is important. So years managing microfinance loans. So on average, anybody that we spoke with had 3.4 years of experience working with microfinance loans. So this is for Jalna. And so for Parbhani, you can see it's incredibly similar. Again, the mean age is 37, age range 24 to 62. Average monthly income is a bit smaller. Education the same. Marital status, more married woman, and dependent is 2.6. In Parbhani, this was our religious composition breakdown. This is actually somewhat unfortunate. Parbhani has a larger population of Muslim communities than Jalna, but it was also quite difficult to speak with those individuals. Securing interviews proved to be challenging because the communities there's still a lot of tension because of the issues. So they're not as representative in our sample. And again, years managing microfinance loans, it's similar to Jalna. So this is a slide that I've showed before. This information is actually taken from our capital's loan pools. And so this is just for Jalna and Parbhani. You can see the breakdown that we're looking at, Jalna, Parbhani, and Jalna. And basically it's just displaying the default finding. So you're looking at the number of clients who are shown to be defaulted on their loan. And so, okay, I think this is, okay, well, I'll just go to that. Exactly what this is.
You can use the pointer actually.
So you can see that in Parbhani, within a week, 35% of the portfolio had defaulted, right? So we're talking about a very quick default here. That's within the following week. But this is the portfolio of 201, so it's not like the entire city was defaulting. And again, this is something that we'll be able to observe much better when we have our microfinance client data set. And in Jalna, again, you can see that around the 16th of January, 20% goes up to 45%, and within another week, it's almost 84% of the 395 clients and loans that we have on record were defaulted.
So we expect the number of days.
I can't remember. I was like, oh, let's use this slide, and I can't really remember exactly what that exactly is.
We're talking about October 2010. So all this period, I think, is a number of days. 20 students.
I mean, that's what it should be, right?
That's the reason here.
Yeah.
The days.
Like, clearly that's what's trying, I think maybe this was just labeled badly, and I didn't, so I apologize for that. But yeah, I think this is just trying to display, the percentage or number of clients defaulting, and you can see that it's a sharp spike, right? So clearly it happens quite quickly. Okay, so this is, the next couple slides are going to focus mainly on the facilitated group discussion data that we have, which is actually really interesting to look at. So first, I put up information regarding the trigger, right? So when I presented this at the CMS CAP conference, that was something that people were generally really interested in knowing. You know, apart from what are the issues, what causes that trigger, what causes people to suddenly react. And I mean, I'm still probably far from answering this question, but looking at our data, we can kind of clearly identify one or two things separately that happened in Jalna and Parbhani. So Parbhani is where the default started, and there was a clear record of credit officers basically getting beat up in the street. And so, you know, it's interesting to kind of see that an event like that occurs, and within 1 to 2 weeks, immediately an entire community is defaulting, right? So I would say that regardless of what other underlying issues there were, and there definitely were underlying issues, as to why people weren't happy or what was causing the issues, it was this specific incident of, you know, 25 people going to the street and beating up credit officers. I can't say if it was exactly one incident or two incidents or three incidents. In the FGD data that we have, they do cite like specific locations. But this is what caused that initial spark in Parbhani. And so this is, like I said, just kind of some anecdotal evidence. Like I said, them citing locations on Vanji Road, staff of the company were beaten up, they were threatened by local people. So another interesting thing about Parbhani is, for better or for worse, there's one individual whose name is continually mentioned. And so it seems that in Parbhani there was kind of localized revolt against the MFIs. And I guess in the next slide I'll kind of discuss why that might have been. But it was almost like a gang type of thing. Where there was like a gang of people who were really unhappy. There was a gang leader, and they just kind of, it was very like internally within the community, right? I would say very like grassroots. It was like grassroots rebellion against the MFIs that got violent. And then either because credit officers weren't comfortable visiting the neighborhood anymore, or because people were scared about themselves having violent attacks, that people just stopped paying their loans. At least people in those communities. In Jalna, there does seem to be cases of kind of like riots and fighting incidences, but it's much less clear. I would almost say, myself, looking at the data and the time that I spent in Jalna, I would say the violence, 50% true, 50% not true. I'm not sure. In Parbhani, it's clear it happened. In Jalna, it almost seems a bit like rumors. If somebody was beat up over there, so that's why we didn't do it. But what's interesting about Jalna is there's a much more formalized public campaign. There's evidence of pamphlets, newspaper articles, people actually campaigning against the MFI. And if you remember, Parbhani was the first to default, and then a month or two later it was followed by Jalna. Right? So, I mean, I guess that makes sense. Something kind of happening locally and then it's developing into something a bit more formalized in other towns. But it seems that the riots but more importantly, the public campaigning is what really kind of set off the default of Jalna. So we can kind of credit that as the initial trigger there. So then we have these acts of violence. Okay, great, but that's only a little bit telling, right? You more want to understand exactly why people were reacting that way, what was causing the issues. So in Parbhani, it's quite clear that, like I said, this one individual, this kind of like gang, was involved in money lending activities that I guess their business was affected once the MFI was giving more loans, right? And this is kind of like the typical nightmare that everybody doesn't want to know, microfinance, but it was the case here, where there's definitely record. We have record of there being social tensions, right? So maybe issues with credit officers acting inappropriately, or there's just being tension between Muslim communities and having outside male credit officers coming into the community or whatnot. But the most cited kind of like underlying cause of the default that we have on record is this kind of unrest with people who were formerly money lenders, and they were now having competition for their business. They kind of set off these riots. Interestingly enough, in Jalna, by far the most cited reason for why there was defaults was people couldn't pay their loans. It was over-indebtedness. Individuals didn't have the capacity. It's never mentioned in Parbhani. We have literally like maybe one or two records of somebody saying, oh, we couldn't pay our loans. Whereas in Jalna, that's by far the most cited reason for why the defaults were occurring. So yeah, basically saying, interestingly enough, there was always somebody else, right? It's never I couldn't pay my loan, and there was this one woman who couldn't pay the loan. But yeah, so you can kind of just see that even with these community defaults, that there can be a lot of different reasons for why they occur. But so yeah, and in Jalna, 39% of the groups cited too many loans or inability to pay as the underlying cause of community defaults, which is actually pretty significant. So then, kind of seeing those as the primary causes, what are the secondary causes of default? And these are all cited in our kind of facilitated group discussion. They haven't been quantified as of yet. So at some point I'll be citing numbers more on some of these points. But so the peer effects, like I said, being kind of in two categories. The first being, you know, somebody within a group can't pay, doesn't want to repay, and so therefore everybody else is not doing defaults, right? And so when we're talking about these mass community defaults, it's important, although quite difficult, I think, to distinguish between individuals who are defaulting because they're actually scared of like violence, like wounds or something like that, and individuals who are simply just defaulting because other people in their group were defaulting. Maybe they weren't personally scared, maybe they were part of a community that, you know, wasn't directly affected by this like negative reaction of the community, but because either surrounding groups were defaulting or because members within their own group were defaulting, they suddenly weren't able to repay their loan. Again, so the surrounding groups is another thing that's quite noticeable in the evidence that we have. Nobody else was paying, so why should we repay, right? Nobody else was paying, so we didn't think we would get a new loan, which is another big thing. And so kind of seeing that these peer effects have a strong effect on people's kind of willingness to pay for their loans. And it's important to understand. I don't think that it's always, you know, the first initial reaction. A lot of times it's going to be secondary effects. The lack of new capital. So this was a hypothesis that we initially had, and it's quite evident, especially in the Parbhani data that we have. In Parbhani, they referenced the Andhra Pradesh crisis quite a few times, and basically state after 25 weeks, they didn't give us a new loan. So we stopped repaying, right? Which I think has a lot of implications. Maybe it's a smart customer. But also kind of how the actions of an MFI can affect or kind of worsen this kind of crisis, right? So, you know, people are hearing about a crisis in Andhra Pradesh. They start kind of second guessing the long-term sustainability of the microfinance institution. Are they going to keep giving me loans? And then even within their own city, they see women who, once they get this kind of like 25-week benchmark where they're supposed to be given a secondary loan, they don't get it. 30 weeks comes, they still don't get it. 35 weeks comes, they still don't get it. Stop repayment, right? Because the number one incentive for repaying your loan is in order to get a new loan. So I think this is a really important point. And I wish I could have some way of indicating how many people defaulted because they weren't getting new capital all the time. But out of our, 96 cases that we have on record, we'll eventually be able to stop how many cases we've been. And the third point, just an inability to pay. So this is quite simple, but I think actually where microfinance companies have the most potential to kind of react and grow. Over and over and over again, people cite credit officers can't come to our house, so therefore we can't pay. We had no issue with the credit officer stopping, right? And I mean, obviously, as a microfinance company, you can't risk your credit officer's safety and send them off the field if there's, fights going on in the street. But just think about how much potential for kind of lowering the default there is if individuals had some way of repaying their loans without there having to be an outside individual coming and sitting with them in their community, or without them having to physically leave their community and go and repay their loan. And so, I think that having new ways for repayment would benefit the industry kind of overall, and it's something that's kind of growing, the demand is increasing. But a situation like a mass default is a pristine example of where that could really help and benefit the industry, right? Instead of me, having to sneak out of my house and being worried about my community reacting, if I could just, pick up my cell phone and do my repayment, how many individuals would no longer be defaulting? So I think both of these points are really important because they kind of reflect the MFI's actions. And that also means that there's a lot of potential for change there. How does the information regarding the default spread? Word of mouth was the number one reason cited in Parbhani. Everybody said we've heard from our neighbors. We heard from our neighbors, we heard from the community. It was interesting because in Jalna they didn't say that. In Jalna oftentimes they said we read in the newspaper, we saw it on a pamphlet. Okay, but so, word of mouth, we can understand that groups are communicating and therefore the default will spread. Okay, that makes sense, right? The second most cited reason was credit officers themselves. And so I think this is again something where MFIs can, look at their staff and look at their operations and say, okay, was our staff possibly talking to individuals about this crisis and only spreading it themselves, right? Especially if it's something that you're not necessarily prepared for, how can you expect your credit officers to always be reacting in the best possible method? But this is maybe something to take forward, ways of reacting in the field when there's issues like this occurring. And like I said, in Jalna there was heavy use of pamphlets and newspapers and publications for the default, which, obviously would cause the information to spread. What the MFIs can do about that, I don't know exactly, but at least, it's cited. Okay, so almost finished here. This is basically some of the initial hypothesis testing that we've done regarding characteristics of defaulters that we think might be significant and that we would want to take forward in future testing. So some of the things that we tried to test, marital status, unfortunately there's so little variation that it's not even worth testing for us. So repayment schedule, so basically I looked at, I clumped everything that was non-weekly together and then was testing between weekly and non-weekly payments and seeing if there was any significance, and there's not at all. So, loan size, which my hypothesis was that it might be significant, was found to be insignificant, but hoping to maybe combine this with some other descriptive statistics or variables, and I think that could have other impact. For example, how many years have you been working on the 5, and your loan size up to the date for it, so that would be interesting to see. Upfront fees collected was significant, but it was negative, which is not what I was expecting. I was expecting, my hypothesis was, the more that you invest in your loan, the less likely you will be to default on it, right? But it was actually the opposite of that, is what the results found. So I don't think that may be something that I need to kind of like test out my regressions a bit more. But it is something that I'm going to follow up with in our further quantitative testing. So placement and loan cycle. And so I just did a graph of this. It looks like there's kind of no trend whatsoever. So the logical hypothesis would be, if I was an MFI customer and suddenly an external shock hit me, right? I would be much more likely to default on my loan if I was in the early part of my loan cycle, right? Because I couldn't build loans. Whereas if I'm in week 40 or week 50, then I'm going to be much less likely because I'm almost done, right? But so when I was thinking about this afternoon, I actually thought there might be a lot of logic behind why it would be clumped right around here. The default would be clumped, right? Because we've already shown that through the FTDs, not receiving a secondary payment was a huge reason for why people were kind of already defaulting. So once they hit that week 25 benchmark, or they're kind of hovering around it, if they're seeing other individuals and neighboring groups not getting their second loans, why wouldn't you just opt out then? You get to week 35, you're not getting a secondary loan, you're supposed to get it 10 weeks ago, so you just opt out. So that may be a reason why, I guess if I do a distributional graph, it is a bit more clustered around the 30 or 40, but 30 to 40 week benchmark, but so let's just put some table on the question again. Total loan count. So basically looking at the number of loans an individual cited as having, number of current loans, and their likelihood of default. So this one was quite significant too. However, it was also opposite of my hypothesis. So I was thinking the more loans you have, the more likely you are to default, right? Totally not the case. It's from our client level data, the more loans you have, you're much less likely to default. So again, this is something that unfortunately will be difficult to follow up with the client data because we'll only have, one MFI data sets at a time. They're not going to be combined, so we can't look at customers across MFI data sets. So I think that we'll maybe try to do some continued testing with our own client data set and see if maybe there's like some things to work out. But at this point, maybe I guess the story could be that more responsible borrowers can handle our loan portfolio.
So maybe the other line is, since you know default, you've been getting particularly loans to offer.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. I think, I think we'll kind of have to look at for each individual loan, what's the amount and exactly when they should be dispersed, and then maybe add some more dependent variables.
Also, I was thinking, you said that the more loans you take, the more likely you are to pay back. Is it possible that I'm taking loan A to pay for loan B?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's often
Isn't it? So like robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Any thoughts that you have looked at on the interest rate sensitivity, if the interest rates have been higher?
So, across MFI, there's no evidence of an individual having defaulted on one MFI versus another because the interest rates are higher. I can test that a little bit more. Slightly complicated, but just how our data set's formatted. But regarding the interest rates in Parbhani, so we asked the question, what was the number one reason for your joining an MFI group, right? 90% of people in Parbhani said interest rates is lower as their first response. Which is interesting because, so many people have cited games with higher interest rates or like, I don't know. Yeah, exactly. So,
what about MFI versus MFI?
Yeah, so
They can't be But yeah, usually coach there, custom there, and they don't want to have the report there, and they don't want to work there.
So what we found is that, I don't actually have the statistic up here, but, so for example, in, Jalna, we have 32 defaulting customers, right? With a total of a bit more loans. Out of those, 23 defaulted on all of their current loans simultaneously. So I guess that meaning that we don't see a lot of differentiation between a defaulting customer on which loans default. We don't see people having 3 current loans just defaulting on one, not defaulting on the other. Kind of like if you do it, you do the whole thing. But I agree, and that was something that we initially were really looking forward to testing. Kind of different characteristics across MFIs and if that impacts some of these default choices. And we haven't found much evidence of that yet. And part of that may be a reflection of our survey instrument. A lot of our rating questions weren't maybe that strong with rating MFI work or quality characteristics. So this is just a really simple graph. So I think this is from, this is overall. So again, this is kind of the clustering effect that we're talking about. If you defaulted, your group members also defaulting a loan. So, you know, yes, some and yes, all, you can see that definitely is going right? So this is very and it was interesting. We asked as well, you know, how did you discuss the decision to default as a group, and how long did you discuss? And we found that most people cited 1 to 2 weeks. If they were actually thinking about making this default decision, discussed it as a group, and then move forward with it. So, I mean, that also can maybe give evidence that there is a window of opportunity, kind of when these community defaults start happening, for MFIs to react and to make an impact on their customers' business.
So this meeting to discuss the amount of question will be called control.
Exactly. Exactly. Clearly discussing, I would say most people cited between 1 week and 3 weeks. And they also say that they not only discuss within their group, they also discuss in the center. Yeah, they discuss as well. Yeah, those would probably be really
So did you ask them regarding
what kind of discussion? So we asked them, did you discuss what was the primary reason cited for defaulting amongst your groups? Who was there? Was essentially the president? Yeah, so we asked them, like, what did you list as the consequences of default, for example? Yeah, I mean, I would say that again, most of the evidence points to people saying either we're not sure we're getting another loan because everything's going really bad here, and so that's why we decided not to, or nobody else around us is paying, so that's why we decided not to. And if they do, you know, because we do have non-defaulting groups in our sample, if they do decide not to default, it's almost always a reflection of the group saying, it was our word that we would repair loans, we will repair them, right? It becomes a very, like, personal, kind of moral thing for the group. External reasons don't matter at all. Definitely just their personal characteristics. Okay, so just quickly the way forward. I still have a lot of work to do on this kind of pre-significance testing, so using our client data to kind of pilot some of our hypothesis ideas. We'll be getting out a summary paper from the SGD interviews very shortly, which will combine this information much better, this PowerPoint way of talking now. And then the last is testing of our major kind of quantitative hypotheses and MFI client data set to get those in our hand. It's definitely a bit challenging. So yeah, so